We are delighted to have with us today Professor Sean Anthony. I think people in the wider field of Islamic studies in North America know him very well, and also maybe Arabists and Islamicists elsewhere. But I will briefly introduce him. He earned his PhD with honors from the University of Chicago in 2009. And from 2010, 2015, he worked as assistant professor at the University of Oregon. But then he moved to his home city, I think, hometown, Ohio. Yeah, he's an associate professor in the Department of Eastern Languages and Cultures at Ohio State University since 2015. He's published many books and articles in the last decade. I will just mention a few. He's a translator of Ma'mar ibn Rashid al-Maghāzī, 2014. Another book, The Caliph and the Heretic. I think that is the original dissertation, I guess. And The Crucifixion and the Spectacle of Death, and so many others. Today, he will be talking to us about his new book, Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, The Making of the Prophet of Islam, which is about the sīra-maghāzī literature and how academic historians can work with that body of material. So we'll have the talk for 40 to 50 minutes, depending on how our professor would like it to be. And then we'll move to a 20, 30-minute Q&A session. If you have a question, I think the best way to go is to send me your name in the chat section. So I go with the names in the order I receive them, because maybe I can't see everybody here on the screen. So without further ado, I will give the floor now to Professor Sean Anthony.
Hi, thanks, Mohammed, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here real fast, so we can all see my slides. You did do this rigmarole, I think. Here we are. Let's get started. Ta-da. Does everybody see that? Is the share working fine? Okay, good. All right. So I just thought I would kind of frame what the new book is about, tell you why I wrote it, why I thought it was important to write it, where I think the field is right now. And I want to also explore kind of an example from the book of some of the things that I'm trying to do with this sīra literature that I hope is new, I hope is interesting. But in any case, to kind of frame where the book kind of fits in the history of kind of Western scholarship on the historical Muhammad. I kind of like to begin with this quote of Maxime Rodinson that comes from his book, which he originally wrote in French was published in 1968. And in the introduction, he kind of discussed the problems or the state of the field of the historical Muhammad. And one of the things that always strikes me about this sentence is as this very sleepy, sorry, my dog is being, or he describes a very sleepy field in which nothing more can be done, nothing more really has to be done. I might as well just read the quote out because it's stark in of itself. He says, "My book does not propose to bring out new facts about the subject. None have been discovered for a long time, and it is unlikely that any will be. Our source material has not grown appreciably, and critical analysis has not advanced since the two remarkable works of William Montgomery Watt." So if that's how things were in the late 60s, that's pretty depressing. I hope that they're not like that anymore, to where there's nothing to be done. But I do think there is a bit of a pall over the field, where early Islamic origins are seen to be mostly site of speculation, very little real discoveries taking place, very little kind of new knowledge being uncovered. And part of the aim of the book is to kind of rebut that and show that there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of very exciting work to be done. And I was kind of inspired by some time that I spent in Princeton at the Institute of Advanced Study with Patricia Crone before she passed. And she, towards the end of her life, even though she was very famous about being a skeptic, she started working on who she called the Quranic pagans, or the mushrikun in the Quran. And she wanted to read, she was massively influenced by Muhammad Shaltut's attempt to do tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, that is to kind of interpret the Quran based upon reading the Quran itself, and kind of taking the Quran seriously as a historical source. And I think that her skepticism never went away. I mean, if you ever met her, knew her, or seen her talk, or kind of read her writings, it would be a very unlikely scenario. But it definitely transformed insofar as she became much more optimistic about what we can achieve in terms of knowledge about the Prophet Muhammad, his companions, his lifetime, his context. In a popular article that she wrote in 2008, she kind of set it out in a very nice, straightforward way. She said, in the case of Muhammad, Muslim literary sources for his life only begin around 750 to 800 CE. I kind of challenged that a little bit. Some 4 to 5 generations after his death. A few specialists in the history of Islam these days assume them to be straightforward historical accounts. For all of that, we probably know more about Muhammad than we do about Jesus. That is, we as historians, let alone Moses or the Buddha. And we certainly have the potential to know a great deal more. So where's this potential come from, right? And also, if you think about it, if we have the potential to know more about the Prophet Muhammad, why in kind of the Western Academy is kind of works on the historical Jesus, his lifetime, the Gospels, etc. Why is that such a huge field, and work on early Islam so small? I mean, there's a lot of historical reasons for that, but if there's more that we can do, we have more materials, we have more historical evidence to work with, it seems like we're really kind of far behind. Anyway, this book that I published, Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, is hopefully an intervention to sort of provide guidance, or at least my view of how we think we can proceed, and also the way in which the field has changed between when Maxime Rodinson wrote his words in the late 60s and when Patricia Crone wrote her words in the aughts. And one of the things that the book tries to highlight is, on the one hand, the transformations that happen in the field, and 2, what I think it should be the hierarchy of sources that we can rely upon when trying to write the biography of Muhammad, and how our understanding of those sources has changed and is continuing to change. So what are those sources, and what are the changes that happen in our understanding of them? So I kind of single out 4. The first is the Quran itself. One of the things that has radically transformed of late is our understanding of the history of the Quranic text, its preservation, radiocarbon dating, our understanding of Arabic paleography has more or less confirmed that the Quran is the primeval document of Muslim religiosity. And there are a lot of challenges to reading the Quran historically, but a lot of times we've seen a flourishing of kind of literary approaches to the Quran. Angelica Neuwirth would be the main representative, but inevitably these literary approaches have produced a lot of historical insight as well. And I think there are also models for reading the Quran as historical text as well, modeled particularly by one of my professors, Professor Fred Donner, in his book, Muhammad and the Believers. There's other approaches to that too, but the first and foremost thing to keep in mind is our textual history of the Quran has been radically transformed, and our ability to consider it to be the primeval document of Muslim religiosity and sort of a text uttered by a man named Muhammad the evidence for that is now very strong, and I think we can proceed from that as one of our major premises. Secondly, there's been important transformations in archaeology and epigraphy, Arabian epigraphy in particular, of the 7th century. there's a lot of work still to be done here, and especially for kind of my interests, which I kind of know the best. Arabian epigraphy, particularly in the area of the Hejaz and Northern Arabia, and also in the Yemen as well, have just absolutely been producing amazing finds of late. And it's advancing at such a fast pace that scholars are having a hard time keeping up, especially as nowadays on Twitter in particular, you have people that are kind of amateur hunters that are becoming extremely knowledgeable and familiar with where a lot of these inscriptions are locating and documenting them online. It's the main reason why I, myself, joined Twitter, perhaps against some of my better judgment. But these documents, I think, are transforming our view of the Arabian Peninsula in particular, in the presence of kind of early Islamic religiosity there and how quick it spread as well. Thirdly, I would say non-Muslim sources are finally being taken seriously, and not only are they seen as important as, say, external confirmation of, say, the Muslim narratives, or mine for like the forensic evidence they have for kind of confirming main parts of the Muslim narrative, but they're being understood as a part of the historical fabric of the 7th century themselves. And we're starting to have more critical and nuanced understandings of those non-Muslim sources when they mention early Muslims, and in particular when they mention the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And lastly, and one of the things that I think I dedicate the bulk of my book to, is our understanding of the Arabic literary sources, I think, is radically transforming. And I'll be exploring some of the ways in which I think that transformation is happening, but to kind of give you a very kind of quick view of something that I'm trying to kind of debunk and get around, is the idea that our main sīra for the Prophet Muhammad that everybody knows, a sīra-maghāzī of Ibn Hisham, the revision of Ibn Ishaq's sīra-maghāzī, as being this bottleneck, this historical bottleneck, right? Either we can take it or leave it, but we can't really work with it type of idea. And that's one of the main things I'm trying to kind of banish from our scholarly discourse and get a bit more historicized and useful approaches to reading the Syrian literature and using it as one historical source amongst these kind of main four. Okay, with that being said, I want to kind of frame the Syria literature and why historians see it as being a problem. And this is maybe a little bit cliche, but it's something that needs to be stated over and over again, because I think there are two competing regimes of kind of evidence. One is the way in which modern historians working out of the Western Academy tend to view evidence and evaluate evidence, weigh evidence. And then there is the way in which predominantly kind of Sunni Hadith traditionalism evaluates and weighs evidence from within their paradigm. And these paradigms sometimes conflict with one another, but I think they're useful to one another as well. So I don't want to portray them as always at odds. But for, I think Sunni Hadith traditionalism, isnads kind of solve all these problems that I'm about ready to address or to describe. But for more kind of modern historical critical methods, isnads do not by any means solve these problems. And I'll give kind of a brief explanation of why. So if we think about Ibn Hisham, I got my little arrow here, maybe you can see, we have him here at 830, dying here at 833. Let's imagine that this is our main account for the Prophet Muhammad's life and like the most minimalist view. And we have this kind of gulf between Ibn Hisham writing in 833 and the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, right? So we have this pretty massive gulf of, I would say, about 2 centuries between the death of the Prophet Muhammad and the death of Ibn Hisham, one of the main compilers of the sīra-maghāzī, or at least one of the more authoritative ones. And if you look at the transformations that happened between, say, the death of Muhammad in 632 in Medina and Ibn Hisham's death in 833, we have not only this massive expansion of the Medinan polity in the Hejaz to a regional, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic empire that stretches from south of the Pyrenees to Fargana in Central Asia. But we also have massive amounts of political upheavals, right? We have the changing of the caliphate across multiple dynasties. We have the establishment of the Umayyad Caliphate, its toppling of the Umayyad Caliphate. We have the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate, and even inside these kind of caliphal, these changes within the caliphal dynasties, we have civil wars that take place. We have the first civil war, which leads to the rise of the Umayyad Caliphate. We have the second civil war, which the Zubayrids challenge Umayyad hegemony over the Caliphate. We have the third civil war, which leads to the fall of the Umayyads and the rise of the Abbasids. And we have the fourth civil war between Al-Ma'mun and Al-Amin, the two sons of Harun and Rashid. So these are kind of massive political events. Ostensibly, we have ways of getting around this, right? Because the idea is that Ibn Hisham didn't just write the biography of Muhammad out of thin air. He didn't just take it from nowhere, but rather he was using earlier materials, right? So one of the more simple examples I like to give is the person is often named as one of the earliest, if not the earliest pioneer of the genre of writing dedicated to literary biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, so the sīra-maghāzī literature, and that would be Urwa ibn al-Zubayr, a very prominent Medinan scholar. So he's kind of right here. He dies in 712. We don't have any of his writings that survive, but he's an interesting figure because he's a member of the Prophet's tribe Quraysh. He's part of the creme de la creme of the post-conquest elite of the early Islamic Empire. He is the son of one of the most prominent companions of the Prophet Muhammad, al-Zubayr ibn Awam. He's also the nephew of one of the most important wives of the Prophet Muhammad, Aisha bint Abi Bakr. So he is, on his maternal line, he's related to Abu Bakr and his clan, and on his patrilineal line, he is related to al-Zubayr ibn Awam. He's a top elite individual, and we could regard him as a kind of a son of the first generation of Muslims, right? And so, ideally, if everything that the isnads have for us is to believe, we have this scenario where Urwa tells a story, he passes it on to another very prominent Medinan scholar named Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, and Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri gives it to one of his students, Ma'amar ibn Rashid, this guy whose work I translated, and Ma'amar ibn Rashid hands off his work to Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani, the main person who transmits his stuff. So we have a reasonable way of transmitting the early cultural memory of the early Muslims from generation to generation, right? For the Ibn Ishaq version, it goes from Urwa al-Zuhri, and then you can go to Ibn Ishaq, and then eventually to Ibn Hisham. Actually, I have to skip somebody in order to get to Ibn Hisham, but we're just keeping this simple. So that seems relatively good reason for optimism, but I think that we need to add a little bit of perspective. A lot of times when we throw up these dates and we think about historical distance and historical time, it's easy to compress them in our mind and not to really see kind of the scale that we're talking about. So a lot of times one of the things I do for my students is I try to put the scale of historical distance between the death of the Prophet Muhammad and Ibn Hisham's lifetime or Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani's lifetime on a scale that's commensurate with something in American history, right? So if you take, for example, the American Civil War, right? You make that the thing that you want to write about in American history. You basically have to imagine that Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani or Ibn Hisham is alive right now, right? The Ibn Hisham or Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani will die in the equivalent of, like, say, in the 2050s, 2060s. I always say that perhaps my generation or the people right below me, always remember that you will die. I'm probably not going to be living past 2070 if I live a full life. I'd be almost 100 years old by that time. But one of the things to keep in mind is if we today were to kind of sit down, write, and compile a history of the American Civil War based upon primarily oral sources, we think about our kind of history, or at least American history, the world history, World War II, World War I, Korea, Vietnam, Cold War, Gulf War, Iraq War, Afghanistan. These, all sorts of transformations have happened in American history. And the ideologies and the kind of stakes that come with it follow kind of this history, right? So how we imagine the American Civil War, even today, is highly contested in the American population. And it would be hard to imagine that even in an ideal situation where things were perfectly passed down from one individual to another, that the ideological forces of American history would not impact a historian writing today or living in kind of this current generation that wanted to write about the American Civil War. Okay, well, let me go back one more thing. So that's kind of one of the fundamental basic problems, and we'll kind of return to it and how that impacts some of the major compilers. But I want to go to a little bit to the alternative and what it offers and what it doesn't offer. So the alternative is to rely only on our earliest sources, okay? The sources that are written either by contemporaries of the events that they experience, witness, or they are contemporaries to those people whose testimonies they record. And one of the things that we know from a lot of the earliest evidence is there is no reason to, for example, doubt the historical existence of the Prophet Muhammad, right? One of the more extraordinary things that we have in terms of historical evidence, just for the sheer existence of the Prophet Muhammad, is a fly sheet that basically dates from 637. So it dates within 5 years of the Prophet Muhammad's death, likely. Okay, and this is what it looks like now. Right. And it is probably the earliest document on Earth to mention the name Muhammad and associate it with the movement or conquest or anything like that. So this is essentially our earliest artifact to mention the name Muhammad that we have that survives. And it's fragmentary, right? One of the reasons why we know its date is because it mentions date in this text. But it's interesting too, because it's only one sheet. Okay, this is the only sheet that it's only one sheet that survives. Okay, and the reason is because it's actually written on what's called a fly sheet of a 6th century copy of the Gospels of Mark and Matthew in Syriac. So a fly sheet is that part of the book that when you you take a book like this, right, and you open it up and you get like an opening page, right? Or you have the back and you have this blank page to a book, right? And that's what a fly sheet is. What someone did is they witnessed some sort of raids in their locality, some sort of battle, major battle, and they wrote down on a single page what they saw, right? It's fragmentary, so we can't decipher a lot of it, but we can see the name Muhammad occurs twice in Syriac, right? Here's one example. Here's the other example. This one's harder to decipher, but this one is a lot clearer. And what it talks about is basically Romans and people called Tayoye, which is the Syriac word for Arabs, clashing. And it's very clear that the Romans are losing, right? And that there is someone named Muhammad associated somehow with these Tayoye, right? It's unclear because of the fragmentary kind of nature. And if we go all the way down to the bottom of the text, we get a little bit more clear detail, so we know what they're talking about. So we have the Romans fleeing from Damascus and all sorts of other things like this. What we get actually is a mention of the battle of what's called the Arabic sources, the Battle of Yarmouk, or the Battle of Gabitha, as it's called in the Syriac sources, right? And the date kind of corresponds more or less perfectly with what we find in the later Arabic sources. So it's fascinating, right, that we have this evidence of Muhammad's existence as this early, but it doesn't tell us a lot about him. Right? It tells us a lot about his perception, right? It tells us, one, that the people that were living in the Near East at the time of the Islamic conquest, they recognized that the conquest were happening, right? They recognized that the people that were conducting the conquest, they understood them mostly in ethnic terms. They didn't see them as a religious army. They saw them as Tayoye. They saw them primarily as Arabians, right? And they associated a man named Muhammad with them, right? But there's no sense of who this Muhammad is other than that he's a prominent person, right? You don't have a sense that they called him a prophet or they regarded him as a holy man and a law bringer or someone who came with revelation. Nothing like this, right? We don't get this, at least in this source. It takes a while for this sort of realization to kind of set in. All right. The other thing I want to say is we can use some other examples with Arabian epigraphy to know from other aspect that people like Urwa ibn al-Zubayr, these early sources that are cited in the later Sira literature, really did exist, right? And they really were prominent figures. And I like to show this recently discovered by Dr. Mesa El-Haban, a wonderful kind of epigraphist working in Saudi Arabia, who kind of surveyed the Hisma region, which is kind of nearby Tabuk, and she discovered this amazing inscription by a guy named Habib ibn Abi Habib, which we don't know who he is really, so he's not so much that interesting. If you see this white here, someone unfortunately spray painted over it. It's a modern thing, but this is the actual picture of the inscription. This Habib ibn Abi Habib, though, identifies himself in the inscription as a mawla, or a client of Urwa ibn al-Zubayr, right? So here's his name in the actual transcription, right? And see if we can find, yeah, here is it in the actual inscription in the photograph. So we know these people are real, and they definitely existed, and all this other stuff too. There's actually just recently, I didn't include it in my slide, someone posted on Twitter that they discovered a inscription with the name of Muhammad ibn Ishaq's father, which was interesting as well. Not Muhammad ibn Ishaq himself, but his father. Okay, that being said, who are the main compilers of the Sira tradition that I think that one can most reasonably reconstruct, and why are they prominent, and why do they play a prominent role in the Sira literature? Part of the book is interested in identifying these figures, putting their lives in their own political and historical context, and understanding why it is that when we look at the Sira literature and the way that it survives and the way that it looks today in the later sources it survives, why are these kind of prominent figures? Why do they always kind of appear as sort of hubs for the transmission of the past? So there are three main figures that I think are probably the most important. Urwa ibn Zubayr is one of them, but we can know, I think, the least about him. The person after Urwa ibn Zubayr that we can know the most about is a figure from Medina named Ibn Shihab Zuhri. And then after Ibn Shihab Zuhri, we have Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Shihab Zuhri, like Ibn Ishaq, who is his student, is extremely important for the history of kind of writing what is called in the earlier generations ilm, or just knowledge about kind of the past, the sunnah, the traditions of the Prophet, his life, his conduct, etc. And one of the reasons why he's particularly important is because, one, he was quite knowledgeable, of course, but also because he had very intimate connections with the Umayyad court. These connections are something that he cultivated in the wake of the Second Civil War. It began in the reign of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan. And in particular, it basically became a courtier and then also a teacher of many of the Umayyads and their sons. He also traveled frequently between the Umayyad courts and wherever the Umayyad caliphs were in Medina. So this map shows all of his kind of main travels. One thing that happens importantly towards the end of his life during the reign of Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik. So Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, his reign ends at 744, 2 years before Zuhri passes away. Is that he's compelled to commit to writing the tradition, the ilm, right? And this is kind of the beginning of attempts to commit to writing hadith, akhbar, so basically historical anecdotes about the Sunnah, about the Prophet Muhammad and his companions and their historical experiences, their lives, and things like this. And this is essentially something that is done by the order of the Caliph, but something that scholars from all over the place can actually participate in. It wasn't confined to kind of the court. But what was made was a kind of official Umayyad collection of sort of the history of the empire and the history of Muhammad's prophecy up to their time, right? And what we have that survives from this Umayyad archive that was produced by al-Zuhri with Umayyad patronage is not what the Umayyads had in their kind of Khalifa archive. We have kind of snips and different kind of portions that his students that studied with him at that court kind of copied for themselves and transmitted to other students. One of the most important of these students is Muhammad ibn Rashid. That's one of the reasons why I translated his sīra-maghāzī that's preserved in Abd al-Razzaq as-Sanāni's Musannaf. What happened to all of Zuhri's writings? We don't know. We know that they survived partially, but they were probably destroyed with the Abbasid Revolution. It was a very kind of violent takeover for the Umayyads. The Umayyad dynasty was basically all of its members were slaughtered in almost in their entirety, except for famously Abd al-Rahman, who escapes to Al-Andalus. But Zuhri is a kind of a massive pivotal figure for that reason. If we look at Ibn Ishaq, his student, we have a very similar scenario, except his book survives longer in posterity, and there's more versions of it. So Ibn Ishaq himself was a Medinan, like Zuhri. He was a descendant from non-Arabs, unlike Zuhri. Zuhri himself was from Quraysh. He was from the clan of Zuhra, that's his nisbah. He traveled pretty relatively widely in his life, but in the beginning of his life, he really only traveled between Medina and Egypt, going to Alexandria to study under, for example, Yazid ibn Abi Habib. But he has to leave Medina around the same time as the Abbasid Revolution because he has a big feud with another scholar of Medina named Malik ibn Anas. And he goes to Medina and he immediately makes himself available for the patronage of the newly enthroned Abbasid caliphs. Particularly, this is Al-Mansur and Hashemiyya before Baghdad was born. And he begins to kind of transmit his masterpiece, this sīra-maghāzī, in southern Iraq. But he subsequently goes to many different courts of the Abbasids. He goes to Harran, where he teaches. He also goes to Rai, where he teaches under al-Mahdi. And then by the time Baghdad is constructed under al-Mansur, he returns towards the end of his life and he dies. He's the first kind of major scholar to be buried in Baghdad. And I hear that his grave still exists there. You can still visit it, but I've not been able to find an actual picture of it. I would love to have one if anybody knows where I can find one. Anyway, so why go over these figures, his personal histories and things like that? Well, one of the reasons to keep it in mind is to understand that the political history of the early Islamic polity and the early caliphates impact the Sira literature and its subject matter and the way in which its stories are framed immensely. And this is something that we have to kind of attend closely to. I kind of would like to dive a bit more into specific examples to explain what I mean. Probably one of the most explicit examples that we have is in the stories of the Prophet Muhammad's birth, right? We have this theme of kind of the light of prophecy being kind of accompanying his birth and his kind of coming into the world. Probably one of the more famous stories is his mother Amina having a vision of the castles of Syria being filled with light, with this kind of prophetic light that comes from the Prophet Muhammad. So why do these sorts of stories exist? In essence, they exist, I think, in order to tie the imperial legitimacy and the political ambitions of the early kind of caliphal polities to the prophethood of Muhammad, right? A lot of times when you kind of see, when the Sira literature is narrating kind of history on a grander scale and putting the Prophet Muhammad's life in kind of a broader context, of a larger sweep of history and the political context of Arabia and things like that, they take this opportunity to answer the question, how does the prophethood of Muhammad and the fact that he came to the peoples of the Hijaz, how does that sort of feed into our political legitimacy and our right to kind of claim political hegemony over kind of the Near East and North Africa and Central Asia and all other places in which the caliphal polity was expanding, right? This is expressed, I think, really vividly in a saying attributed to Ka'ab al-Ahbar, or Ka'ab the rabbi, in which he basically is saying that he found the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad's coming in the Torah, right? The tradition doesn't actually cite the Torah. It adapts the suffering servant passage from the book of Isaiah from the 42nd chapter. If you know the verse, you'll kind of vaguely recognize it. But I just want to really focus on the actual themes. Is in the Torah it says, Muhammad is my chosen servant. He is not crude nor coarse, nor does he raise his voice in the streets. He shall not repay evil with evil, but rather be clement and forgiving. And this is the last part that he adds. His birthplace is Mecca. His place of refuge is Taiba. So this would be Medina. It's another name from Medina. And his dominion, his mulk, is in Syria and Sham. Right? So Sham becomes kind of the place of the seat of the prophetic mulk. It's probably days of the Umayyad period, right? And you kind of can see this progress of kind of salvation history going through these three stages, right? So the emergence of the Prophet Muhammad in the Meccan context, right? The Hijra and the establishment of the early polity in the Medinan context, but really the establishment of dominion, empire, kind of greater kind of political fortunes in the Sham or in the Levant or Syria. I think one of the most interesting traditions and quite famous ones in which this is really played out is in the story of Heraclius and the letter that he receives from the Prophet Muhammad. To give you kind of a quick whirlwind tour of the context, most of the prophetic career of the Prophet Muhammad from it's from 610 to 632 is contemporary with and simultaneous with what's usually termed the last great war of antiquity, that is between the two powers of Persia and then also in Rome. Okay, and this war goes from 602 to 628. All right, and you see the Romans in the green, and then the Persians are in the pink here. And the kind of international importance of this war is very difficult to underestimate. The one point I want to make is that, of course, it appears in the Quran very prominently, and in the surah that's named after the Romans. The surah reads, in English at least, Rome is defeated in nearby land. This probably refers to the Persian conquest of Jerusalem in 614. But after the defeat will be triumph in a few years, for rule belongs to God first and last, and on that day believers will rejoice. So we have here this prophecy, this foretelling of eventual victory, or in the face of the kind of the jaws of defeat at the hands of the Persians, the Romans. This victory was eventually achieved by the Roman Emperor Heraclius, who by 629 one of the things that happens in the conquest of Jerusalem is the suspended Persians take the relic of the true cross. And as the story goes, Heraclius, when he defeats the Persian armies, he regains the true cross and he restores the true cross of Jerusalem in 629. And there's a very interesting story that takes place in 629, right before the conquest of Mecca in 630 by the Prophet Muhammad, in which multiple letters are sent out to kind of the rulers of the world of the time. And one of these letters is sent out to the Emperor Heraclius. But as the story goes, it actually doesn't actually begin with Heraclius receiving a letter. Usually it begins with Heraclius actually perceiving in the stars a sign that a new kingdom is on the rise. All right. And there's this rumor that this kingdom is going to be a kingdom of circumcised people. And so his courtiers gather around him. He's wondering what to do. And he says, well, who can the circumcised people be? And they say, it must be the Jews, right? So you should kill the Jews, is how the hadith goes in the Muslim story. And then rumor arrives that actually, Arabs are, by the way, they're circumcised as well, okay, just like their brethren, the Jews. And so there is a caravan nearby where Heraclius is decamped. And lo and behold, who's in that caravan but no one other than the leader of the Meccan opposition to the Prophet Muhammad and the leader of the Quraysh at the time, Abu Sufyan. Right? This is the progenitor of the Umayyad dynasty too, by the way. So in any case, Heraclius orders Abu Sufyan to come and also his companions. And he checks to see if they're circumcised. Lo and behold, they are circumcised. Right? And Heraclius, according to the Muslim story, then begins to interrogate Abu Sufyan. Right? He interrogates Abu Sufyan, and he comes to this conclusion that the Prophet Muhammad is himself indeed the Prophet. Okay? So the emperor of the Romans, he believes in Islam in a weird kind of way. And so this is how the question and answer session goes. It's very interesting. It's quite an entertaining story. It's really well kind of composed. So Heraclius says to Abu Sufyan, he says, how is he, that is the Prophet Muhammad, esteemed among your people? Is he well esteemed? Was a king among his ancestors? No. And then he says, have any of you accused him of mendacity or lying before this? He says, Abu Sufyan says, no. He says, who are his followers, the powerful or the powerless of your people? And then Abu Sufyan says, oh, the powerless. Do their numbers increase or decrease? And Abu Sufyan says, they increase. Has anyone left his religion or apostatized out of displeasure with him? And Abu Sufyan says, no. Have you had battles against him? Abu Sufyan says, yes. How have the battles gone? No, there's a stalemate. Is he in for treachery, that is for breaking his treaties? He says, no. And then has any of your people made this claim before him? And he says, no. He goes through kind of each of these questions. And then Heraclius is able to kind of deduce that this person must indeed be a true prophet. And then Abu Sufyan has this great line at the end. He's like, oh, this is amazing. Like, will you believe it? Probably one day I'll even end up being a believer. And of course, the following year he does become a believer. He becomes a Muslim himself. It's one of the great kind of set pieces of the Sīra literature. Right? It's transmitted by our kind of main authors of the Sīra too. So if we look at our kind of basic isnad map, right, we see Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Shihab Zuhri as very kind of important transmitters of the story. Almost every single version of the story is transmitted from Ibn Shihab Zuhri or from Ibn Zuhri through Ibn Ishaq. All right, so these are kind of the main figures in the story. One of the things that is fascinating about this story, however, I think not a lot of people have paid attention to, and I think is one of the things that I'm trying to encourage more scholars to do through my book, and when I kind of study this tradition, is to look at whether or not the story is interacting with kind of its broader historical context and its broader milieu, kind of the broader late antique milieu. So what do I mean by that? So if we look at something like this kind of transmission cluster of the story and all of the kind of different versions that it exists in, it's preserved in, I would call this a vertical study, right? So vertically, we look in its reception history within the tradition, inside the Muslim tradition. And so what I want to kind of add to this, and what I think is important to add to a lot of these analysis, is something that I'll call a horizontal analysis. So the question is, do these stories have anything in common with or any interaction with stories that are contemporary with either Ibn Shihab Zuhri or Ibn Ishaq, or that precede them from the late antique world? And can we kind of see the influences on the story that are not readily visible by just looking at the isnads and the vertical transmission story of the tale? One of the things that I want to point out before I proceed, because it'll make what I say next make a bit more sense. In Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri's story, and some versions of it, he mentions a figure named Ibn Natura, who will return to, who provides him with some of the information that he uses in the story. And so we're going to return to that. I want you to keep it in your mind. But first, I want to show you kind of a rather interesting aspect of the story. So this story of Heraclius having a vision of a coming kingdom of the circumcised is extremely widespread in Christian literature, not just in Muslim literature, of course, but also in Christian literature. And it's very widespread in a wide array of sources and a wide array of languages, right? If we look at, this should be 600 here, but we look at Latin sources, it appears in the Merovingian Chronicle, called the Chronicle of Pseudo-Fredegar. It appears in the Byzantine Arab Chronicle of 724. It appears in the Life of Benjamin, probably originally written in Coptic, but only survives in a Christian Arabic translation by Severus ibn Qafa, called The History of the Patriarchs of Alexandria. It survives in the Chronicle of Siyar. It survives in Old Georgian translation of a book called Pseudo-Wansher. It's extremely widespread, not merely within the Arabic sources. And I think the most interesting is this early one here, Pseudo-Fredegar, because he's writing in the 650s, right? So the 650s is just nearly 20 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, all right? This story appears. And we're fortunate in this case, too, to have a very early manuscript of this Merovingian chronicle, okay? So this is being written in Frankish lands, right? They give you an idea of the distance that we're talking about. The earliest manuscript that we have for this chronicle, the Fredegar Chronicle, dates to around 715. So it dates to pretty in the middle of Zuhri's life, right? Zuhri dies in 742, and this manuscript dates to around 715. So we know for sure that the Muslim tradition doesn't influence this Latin chronicle. Let's read the Latin version, and we'll kind of see what we learn from it. So this is how the story goes in the Latin story. The Emperor Heraclius, being well read, he practiced astrology, by which art he discovered, God helping him, that his empire would be laid waste by circumcised races. So he sent the Frankish king, Dagobert, to request him to have all the Jews of his kingdom baptized. Now, the forcible baptism of the Jews of the Byzantine Empire, right on the cusp of the Islamic conquest, is very widely attested, even outside this source. This is where you get the Arabic version of the order to kill the Jews. It wasn't to kill, but it was rather to baptize, which Dagobert promptly carried out. Heraclius ordered that the same should be done throughout all of the imperial provinces, for he had no idea whence the scourge would come upon his empire. The race of Hagar, now the race of Hagar, this refers to the Hagarenes or the Arabs, who are called the Saracens. The circumcised people who of old have lived beneath the Caucasus on the shores of the Caspian, the country known as Anatolia. This is probably the weirdest part of this text, and it shows a bit of the problems that we get with working with this kind of Merovingian chronicle, because he's very unfamiliar with Eastern geography. He places the Arabs in the Caucasus in the Caspian region. So he sees them more or less as Central Asian people from the steppe. The reason why he does this is not because he has a special knowledge of where the Arabs were coming from, but rather he's associating them with Gog and Magog. So the two kind of peoples from the Central Asian steppe that are kind of supposed to represent the coming of the apocalypse. This race had grown so numerous that at last they took up arms and threw themselves upon the provinces of the Emperor Heraclius, who dispatched an army to hold him. In the ensuing battle, the Saracens were victors and cut the vanquished to pieces. Right? So let's look at it side by side with Zuhri's version of the story. He says, Heraclius was a seer who would peer into the stars. One day when he awoke, the people of his court found his countenance to be so strange. So they asked him, what troubles you? And he said, I peered into the stars last night, and I saw that the kingdom of the circumcised, whether it's Malik or Mulk is a bit difficult to tell, but both work, has appeared. Do not let this trouble you, they said, for the Jews are circumcised. Dispatch an order to your cities to have every Jew killed. And Heraclius wrote to one of his fellow seers who peered into the stars, and the other seer wrote to him the like which he had said to his court. The ruler of Busra, or Busra in Arabic, sent to him a man from among the Arabs to inform him about the prophet. So Heraclius said, "Look, is he circumcised?" And they said, "They looked to see, and lo, he is circumcised." This, they said, is the king of the circumcised that has appeared. This person ends up being kind of Abu Sufyan. So we have this really extraordinary connection between a Latin source being written in the 650s and a source being compiled ostensibly during the reign of Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik in the Umayyad period. So how are these sources kind of interacting? How is this kind of possible that they have any overlap kind of whatsoever? All right. Well, part of the clue or the answer, I think, lies one in some of the odd language that we get in the Arabic version. One of our first clues is the word haza, which is very rare in Arabic. I think this is the only hadith in which it occurs. It's very Syriac sounding, at least to me, someone that reads Syriac. But there we have a bit better evidence in the next kind of portion of the story. So at the end of the story that I just told you, there arrives a letter from the Prophet Muhammad to Heraclius. It's a very kind of famous letter. And in that letter, the Prophet Muhammad writes to Heraclius. He calls him Azim al-Rum, which might mean Augustus. Azim could be Augustus, but the Emperor of Rome is how I translate it here. He says, "Then peace be upon those who follow guidance." And he says, "Now to the heart of the matter, I summon you with the summons of Islam. Submit and be saved. Submit and God will reward you twice over." And then we have this really interesting line in the letter. It says, "But if you turn away, then you will fall to the sin of the tenants." And the Arabic here is arisiyin. And then we have this quote from the third surah of the Quran: "O people of the book, come to common terms between us, so that we shall worship none but God and bear witness that we have submitted to God, or that we are Muslims." So this word arisiyin is what I want to pay attention to. One thing I want to say is that this letter, there's a lot of fake relics out there that you can find on the internet and museums and things like that, but it's been forged many a time. None of them are real. All of them are paleographically wrong. However, it does have some very early language in this text, and we see it in this word in particular, al-risiyin. What does it mean? A lot of modern translators have had a lot of problems with that. Some people translate it as heretics and stuff, but that's totally wrong. A lot of our early hadith commentators or other versions of the hadith replace this word aris with ashar. So people that work the ashar lands, they replace it with falah, or they define it as falah, or they also with akar. These are all words that kind of mean tenants of a land, people that work a land that they do not own. All right. But the version that has the word aris seems to be the oldest, and we know this because you have this very interesting kind of difference in dialect for how I need to back up. So what does this sin of the tenants refer to? I should have said this refers to a famous parable of Jesus. It appears both in Gospel of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and even in the Gospel of Thomas. And the sin of the tenants here refers to this parable of Jesus, in which Jesus talks about a landowner that built up a farm, and which he cultivated grapes and pressed wine and things like that. And then he left that farm or that land into the care of tenants. And he would send messengers in his absence to kind of see how well they were doing in terms of taking care of that land. And they would kill or abuse each of those messengers that were sent. And then eventually in the original parable in the Gospels, God decides to send Jesus, his son, and they even kill them. And for that reason, the land is taken away from the tenants and given to a new people. Right? That's kind of the basic gist of the gospel parable. Here it seems that in this letter attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, we have the same dynamic, right? That Heraclius and the Romans are seen as being kind of wicked tenants, or at least tenants that need to repent lest God take away their land. And if they do not repent and recognize the message of the Prophet Muhammad, it will be taken away. So here the sin of the tenants is the same sin that is mentioned in the parable of Jesus. And the warning of the Prophet Muhammad here that he's writing to Heraclius is that his land is going to be taken away because of his wickedness, unless he heeds to the message of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad. So the parable is no longer interpreted Christologically, it's interpreted prophetologically. So anyway, back to our other little thing. If we, because it's a very odd word, we can actually locate where it comes from geographically. So if you look at translations of the New Testament, all Syriac translations of the New Testament use the word palohe for the tenants. So it's like the Arabic falah, right? Same word. However, there is a dialect of Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. There's a dialect of Aramaic that was spoken in Palestine, also Sinai, other places too, in which the Gospels were translated into, called Christian Palestinian Aramaic. And in those texts, they actually, for the word they use for tenant is aris, or arisim in the plural, okay? And so we know that whoever composed this text is relying not upon sort of a kind of a Syriac Vorlage or Syriac kind of forerunner or model archetype, but rather they're relying upon Christian Palestinian Aramaic. And so that places us, interestingly, to a Palestinian source, okay? And so just to give you kind of a quick rundown of the major seas of Christianity at the time of the rise of Islam, you see on this little map, we basically have a number of patriarchal sees that are associated with their own kind of liturgy, their own self-governance, and you have languages that tend to predominate them. So most famously, you have Rome dominated by Latin, you have Alexandria and Egypt dominated by Coptic, we have Constantinople, predominantly Greek, we have Antioch, predominantly Syriac, and then when we have the patriarchal see of Jerusalem, we have this mixture of Greek and this Christian Palestinian Aramaic, okay? So fascinatingly enough, Ibn Shihab Zuhri actually names his source. He gives his source a name. We have that in multiple versions, right? He says that his source was this guy named Ibn Natura, right? For the story. And he says that Ibn Natura was the leader of Aelia, so this is the Aelia Capitolina, one of the Roman name for Jerusalem. And Heraclius appointed him bishop of the Christians of Syria, and he narrated that when Heraclius arrived in Aelia, and then he tells the story. Okay. And the version of Ibn Ishaq, it's a bit more involved, in which Ibn Shihab Zuhri is talking about his Christian source. Ibn Shihab Zuhri says, bishop of the Christians whom I met in the time of Abd al-Malik related to me that he was acquainted with that matter concerning the messenger and Heraclius and his insight, and he said, when the letter of the messenger of God kind of arrived. So can we kind of guess who this source is? We probably can't guess who he was as an individual. In the book, I suggest that he's actually, the word Ibn Natura, that name, probably derives from something like the Syriac Notar Dohto, which is mean like the person that occupies the seat on behalf of the patriarch when no patriarch has been yet appointed. But in any case, what we have is this kind of very clear example where the Christian historiographical tradition, in particular, the kind of local historiographical tradition of late Roman, Byzantine Palestine and early Islamic Palestine are intersecting with the early Islamic tradition, right? And one of the things that I kind of hope we can do more of in the future is to kind of combine the vertical readings of these traditions within the Muslim tradition with kind of close horizontal readings, where we do this kind of comparative readings of what the Muslim tradition is saying and the non-Muslim traditions are saying, and trying to see places where they kind of intersect. And I think we run into some rather kind of surprising conclusions when we see where many of the Sīra stories are coming from. They're a lot older, I think, in other words, than many people have previously suspected. Anyway, I'll leave it there and I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I was wondering I will ask maybe, when you talked about that, maybe we have different similar stories.
Yeah.
If I remember, maybe you didn't support maybe the idea that maybe this came from Byzantium. Maybe there was some original story that was that originates from Byzantium and then disseminated elsewhere. Because
so what's probably happened is that we have an Eastern source that is probably composed in Palestine in the wake of the early Islamic conquest. And we don't have that original story. That story is lost through the vicissitudes of history, right? But it reflects some story that originates in kind of early Islamic Palestine. But we have one version of it that survives in its earliest attestation in this Merovingian chronicle that we know was relying upon Byzantine sources, right? So somehow it arrives in Merovingian France, right? And it becomes a part of Pseudo-Fredegar. But it has another path that it takes in which it becomes a permanent kind of part of, well, first kind of the early Umayyad historiographical school based mostly on Musafa, embodied by Ibn Shihab Zuhri. And then after it becomes part of Ibn Shihab Zuhri's tradition, it becomes one of the mainstays of the kind of early Arabic historiographical tradition and the Hadith in general. Right? This story and Ibn Torrance appears in works like Bukhari. This is a mainstream story.
Yeah, that's interesting because I also read an article about maybe the first Latin biography of the Prophet. I think it's Eulogius of Cordoba.
Yeah, that's right.
And there was a study that some of the material there is influenced by John of Damascus.
Yeah.
There is no textual, you cannot trace that textually because it was transmitted by a monk or some monks orally.
Yeah.
So I may not find some textual evidence, but maybe people were traveling around and the story would be composed or said somewhere, but then it's everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of so John Damascus is a very kind of interesting figure for that type of material. One, because he comes from a Christian family that was deeply ensconced in the kind of higher echelons of the kind of Umayyad administration. And two, his writings are very influential, not just his polemics against Islam, but also kind of other things that he writes as well. There's a lot of things attributed to him that he didn't actually write, but in general, this is, with this slide here, that I don't know if it's still being shared. Can you guys still see it? This is actually a picture of him, our earliest picture of John of Damascus. At first, I thought maybe Ibn Torah would be John of Damascus, but it's definitely not him. But in any case, he knows a bit about the Quran, but I think there's evidence that he knows things that are outside the Quran as well. One of the things that is fascinating to me is he has this, you have to always read him as a polemicist and ask, well, okay, he's making a polemic against something, but what is inspiring his polemic, right? What is the thing that's behind the polemic that he's responding to? And so one of the polemics that he writes against the Prophet Muhammad is he says that he received revelations in his sleep, right? Which that's not something that you get in the Quran, right? But that is something that you get in the Sīra literature, right? With the first ru'ya sadiqa, that so the true vision that the Prophet Muhammad has the first time when he sees Gabriel on Mount Hira. Many of the accounts it says that it happened fi manamihi, right? Well, while he was asleep, right? While he was sleeping. And so it's sort of a vision that happens to the Prophet Muhammad a while after he has fallen asleep. And so it seems to me, at least, that he's getting that. He's gleaning some of his information from non-Quranic material too.
That's interesting. So I have a few more questions, but I open it to our participants here. Saleh?
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm Salih Kaymakçı, a recent PhD from the History Department at Georgetown University. And I'm working on political thought and legal history, Ottoman and European, like comparatively. My question is this, in the Ottoman historiography, we also have this problem of lack of primary sources, literary sources for the first 200, 300 years. And, then the historians have to come up with, creative ways of writing this history. And obviously this doesn't mean that Ottomans did not exist at the time, but, who they were, what their origins were, and so on. It's all debated. Even the name of the Osman, like the founder, is kind of debated. And if he's a historical fiction or reality. So how can you draw parallels between kind of other historiographies, like the Ottomans or maybe other, historiographies elsewhere, where you have problem of earlier sources? And then how can you maybe like draw parallels between the earlier Islamic historiography and also what you can learn from this, what these different fields can learn from each other, from these historiographies, like in writing the history of earlier days? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. So one of the things that I think is a bit of a trope about early Islam that I think is maybe a bit overblown is really how bad our sources are, right? So for one, I mean, imagine if we had from Osman a text that was the size of the Quran, how much we would be able to work with, right? If we had something more than like a inscription about, Ghazi this or Ghazi that, right? So we have the Quran, that's a pretty massive amount of material. It's hard to extract a historical narrative from it, but you can get a lot of information from it, right? And one of the other things that I argue is that if you look at the number of sources that do mention a figure named Muhammad that describe in some way the history, the unfolding of the early Islamic conquest and the people that were kind of building the early Islamic empire. And also we add to that insights that we can get from epigraphy, papyrology, archaeology. You take all that stuff, you put it together, and if you are systematic enough and you're careful enough, you can actually get what I call a low resolution view. Okay, so you get like this this baseline view that is low resolution, right? And it's blurry, but you can see the outlines of what it is. And why it's important to kind of get that low resolution view, right, is because we have to have some sort of consensus upon which we can build kind of future conclusions, right? Because a lot of the game of doing history is convincing people that your interpretation is plausible, right? And so if plausibility is the name of the game, in my view, the person who is able to explain most of the data the best, right? Most data fits the explanation is more or less going to be the winner, right? And so if we can take that low resolution view too, we can use that low resolution view in order to see how things evolve and they change. And also we can see what aspects of later sources align with and are and kind of concord with those earlier sources, right? So it requires a lot of creativity, right? So you can't just rely upon, I mean, there's some periods of history for which we have no textual sources whatsoever, right? We have no chronicle or anything. We're exclusively rely upon archaeology or exclusively rely upon what outsiders say and things like that. So in the early Islamic period, we have archaeology, we have epigraphy, we have very early copies of the Quran and things like that. I think we're doing a lot better than a lot of people think that we're doing.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, okay. Jordan?
Yes, hi there. Thanks so much for this. I have two questions. One's shorter and one's maybe a little bit more lengthy. The first one is, can you talk a little bit about the title of the book? Because the Empires of Faith is kind of it could be read a lot of different ways. So I was just curious what you were trying to convey with that. I'll let you answer that before I ask my second one.
Okay. The Empires of Faith was my second choice. My first choice was actually Muhammad of Arabia. And it sounds a little bit funny because it's like Lawrence of Arabia, but really what I wanted to communicate with the idea is how important kind of the Arabian context was for understanding Muhammad's life, and also the way in which his history was articulated, in kind of the earliest Sīra literature. But as far as the Empires of Faith, why it works and why I chose it. So basically, it's my way of situating the rise of both the Prophet Muhammad and the early Islamic polity, and the earliest examples that we have of Arabic historiography in this broader context of late antiquity, where communities of faith and imperial communities were more or less fused together, right? And what you have in the writing of the early Sīra literature and kind of the creation of Muslim historical memory of the past is really a story about how the coming of Islam and the coming of its empire is kind of the climax of history, right? And so you have this wedding of faith giving birth not to just a kind of a new people, but also a new polity and a new kind of regional hegemon, right, amongst the many hegemons. And why are they successful? Why are they chosen? And why do they have legitimacy versus kind of their rivals, be it the Byzantines, the Sassanids, or whomever you want to choose?
Yeah. Before you ask the other question, can we, if your professor are done with the screen, maybe we can share the screen and then we can have you all.
Stop the share.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Jordan, do you have?
Yeah, you got a second question.
Sure. So my interest is in Christian theological approaches to the prophet. And so I'm curious how you would envision your thesis, I guess, being taken up by people who are not historians, but who are trying to look at this data to maybe take it to a different level and say, okay, from a Christian theological perspective, how can we evaluate the prophet? Because I think there is a strain nowadays that would say, who buys into a lot of the revisionist literature that would say, oh, we can't know anything about the prophet. We can only know what people thought about him and evaluate that.
Yeah.
So do you think that what you're arguing here is saying, wait a minute, actually there is more that of the historical figure that we have access to and that we can use as the basis for further theologizing?
Yeah, so actually the way that I would put that, so let's put it this way. So if we compare, so we're talking about, like, say, the Christian theological approaches to what we know about the Prophet Muhammad and things like that. So the historical Jesus is equally a problem for Christian theologians to say, one might imagine the historical Muhammad, right? If we kind of look at, just compare like the two cases, right? One of the big things is it seems like we know a lot, for example, about first century Roman Palestine, but we know virtually nothing about the man of Nazareth who's regarded as Jesus Christ, right? In terms of like his reported speech, we have, I mean, even if you accept that all the red letter stuff is something that Jesus of Nazareth actually said, we don't even have it in his original language, right? We have it in Koine Greek. We have it in Gospels written by people who we have no idea who their authors were. Many of the earliest ones, like Mark, had a very dim understanding of even the geography of Palestine. And in general, we look at kind of external historical sources that knew about the existence of a figure named Jesus of Nazareth, and the best candidate would be like Josephus, right? But then after that, there's really kind of a thin amount of evidence. If you compare the Mohammedan case, right, where we have this entire text that is really the epicenter, the birth of the Arabic literary heritage, and as ostensibly his prophetic speech. It's short, a little bit shorter than the New Testament, but it's theoretically, at least, something that all of the words he uttered them, right? The problem, though, is unlike first century Roman Palestine, we know nothing about the Hijaz in the 7th century. So we are kind of grasping in the dark a little bit. But I would say when it comes to kind of Christians trying to think about kind of the theological reaction to kind of what we can know about the Prophet Muhammad and things like that, I think that the best beginning would probably be to start with the Quran, right? Like historians do, and take that kind of seriously. If they want to talk to actual Muslims about what the Quran says rather than just making their own minds, then they need to engage with the reception history. Yeah, and also I think if I do get a little bit frustrated with some Christians that play the game of taking the most radical, skeptical view of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, but then taking the least skeptical, most credulous view of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. So that's a bit of a problem, right? Okay.
Thank you.
No problem.
That's good. Did you have your hand, Stephen? Did you? Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. When your abstract had mentioned the Patricia Crone article, I read it, and the thing that surprised me most about that article was her suggestion that, based on Quranic evidence, that the Muhammad and the early Muslims weren't from Mecca or Medina, but were from some other part of the Arabian Peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder what you or the scholarly consensus thinks of that. And as a more general question, the approach of historical analysis you're suggesting in your book, in what ways does it challenge or question the traditional Muslim understanding of the life of Muhammad?
Yeah. Okay. So I would basically say that her view that the majority of the Quran does, or not the majority, but there's a substantial portion of the Quran or kind of the early message or even the career of the Prophet Muhammad that did not transpire in either Mecca or Medina, but transpired elsewhere, or that there are problems with the idea of the mushrikun being from the Hijaz because of, for example, things that are said about the agriculture or in the Quran and so on and so forth, like these types of things. I would say that's a problem that's not been solved, but I would also characterize the conclusion that we should displace the origins of kind of both Muhammad and his movement from the Hijaz to be a false economy problem. That is, like, whatever insight that you gain by saying you have to move it elsewhere, it creates way too many problems on down the line, right? You have this kind of cascade effect. That's one of the reasons I don't ultimately find it convincing. That's just on that particular point. But when it comes to the idea of what kind of my work challenges about the traditional narrative, one of the things I always like to back up and do is say, whose traditional narrative, which traditional, because there is a very kind of wide array of narratives, right? And then you also have, I think, something that's very interesting that's happening now in this century and what happened started last century, is this kind of Salafist revisitation of the Hadith corpus as well, which is leading to kind of massive kind of reevaluations of how the Prophet Muhammad is considered to be, how he ought to be remembered. And then we have the Shiite project and all other stuff. So usually I like to talk about specific points. So for example, I would not, in the book, I guess one of the arguments that I make is that the Prophet Muhammad was far more itinerant. He traveled far wider than the Sīra literature lets on. So I think that he traveled, so a lot of our earliest sources, so we have Pseudo-Sabios and Armenian sources right in the 660s. We have Jacob of Edessa, that's probably right in the 690s, that describe the Prophet Muhammad as a trader. And even Jacob of Edessa gives him a very kind of wide ambit of the journeys that his trade journeys took him to. They take him up to Phoenicia. So Phoenicia is like the Lebanese coast. They take him into Palestine, they take him into Syria. No source talks about the Prophet Muhammad trading that widely. You basically have two main stories about the Prophet Muhammad conducting trade. One is a journey that he takes with his uncle Abu Talib when he's a young man up to the north in Busra. This is in Ibn Ishaq. And then also you have the trading journey that his wife Khadija is said to have sent him on her behalf. But there's really only two that Ibn Ishaq. There's not really much mentioned elsewhere. And I posit that he was far more itinerant than the Sira lets on, and that the Sira was basically reacting to Christian polemics that portrayed him as someone that was familiar with Jewish and Christian text as a trader. And so there was this attempt to kind of minimize the amount of trading and stuff that was going on. But if you look in the Quran, I think one of the ways in which you can solve the problems that Patricia brings up, if you kind of see Prophet Muhammad as someone that was far more itinerant than the Sira portrays him, especially early on, then I think a lot of the problems make sense. Like, it's very clear to me, for example, that he was present and he saw kind of with his own eyes, a lot of the sites that are along the Trajan Road. I don't know if you know what the Trajan Road is, but it kind of goes up from Aila up to the north, into Jordan and around Palestine and things like that. A lot of these sites that seem to be very widely cited. Then these are with like the Nabatean tombs and things. He seems to be familiar with them, and they're part of kind of the historical imagination of the Quran, of kind of the punished peoples and things like that. But otherwise, I would say that my kind of, in some ways, is very compatible with kind of traditional Muslim accounts of where the Syrian literature comes from and how it evolves. But I think what I'm adding to it, and I would let Muslims decide what consequences that adds for kind of their beliefs and their views, is that this literature was much more in dialogue with, interacting with, and borrowing from other literary genres like hagiography, the Bible, and things like that than you would perhaps expect if you had what I would consider a naive view of the Hadith literature or these stories as merely being an individual's memory passed on from to one individual to another individual to another individual, right? It's something beyond memory. It's something on the level of kind of literary competition and kind of competing with kind of the broader literary genres of the time.
That's good. I will have one last question if no one else
Okay.
has any question, comment. Okay, I'm just wondering, where do you think this work would go? I see like in the first two chapters, it's more about establishing the historicity of some data points about the life of the Prophet. And then the last two chapters takes a different, like a slight shift to how to read these sources in light of the theological literary conventions of late antiquity. So I see there are two major areas that you touch on in the book. And then I was wondering which one or how far this work can go both ways.
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say, so the kind of approach that I am advocating for in a way is one is establishing a bit of a consensus. Like, what is that low resolution view of the Prophet Muhammad as a historical figure? And then the question is, how do we go from a low resolution view to a higher resolution view? And I say, well, basically we have to use the Sira literature, we have to use the stories. And the second part of it is sort of trying to introduce a historical understanding of where the literature comes from and why it looks like it does today, why it's preserved the way that it's preserved today, and also understanding how you should create kind of layers, right? So historical layers when you're reading the Sira literature, and I'll explain what I mean here in a second. So if you encounter any of these stories or any of these episodes from the Prophet Muhammad's life, you're basically encountering them from later works that preserve them for the most part, right? They tend to range from between the 9th century to the 11th century, most of the major kind of collections. And what you have to do once you kind of sift through these and you collate them, you say, okay, I have all these stories. Now, which ones are the earliest, right? And which ones are the middle phase? Which ones are later phase? And all sorts of other things like that. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is introduce a way of thinking about the Sira literature that is a little bit less like bric-a-brac, kind of randomly compiling, oh, there's all these different kind of Hadith traditions and they're just different, and let's pile them all together in this mosaic. That's not what I want us to do. I want us to kind of see if we can find a story that's attributed to, say, for example, Urwa ibn Zubayr, right? And then try to find a story that's attributed to Ibn Shihab Zuhri, then try to find a version that's attributed to Ibn Ishaq, so the major compilers. And someone that I don't mention very much in the book, but is also kind of important, someone like Musa ibn Uqba, like another compiler of the Maghazi literature, and see what they're doing differently, and seeing how each of their kind of generational input to how the story evolves over time, right? So you have to find not merely the transmitters, but the people that are the compilers and the authors, right? So Ibn Shihab Zuhri is not merely a name in the list of isnads, but rather he's the main compiler that's being kind of patronized by the Umayyad court. And all the people that we find after him, whether it be like Shoaib or Yunus or Salih ibn Kaysan or Ibn Ishaq, these people are merely recording what he's saying. And so it's the difference between finding out who the people are that are compiling the stories and actually setting them down, and the ones that are merely transmitting them. Right? So I want to create a more robust stratigraphy of the Sīra literature that will help us kind of proceed.
That's good. Thank you. Maybe there's a question, someone here. Muhammad Ali is here? No?
Yeah. So whatever. So the answer to Muhammad's question is the British Quran article. I'll just type it in there for him.
Thank you. If you don't mind just letting us know the title of the article too.
Okay.
After that question, Mohammed, is there time for one more extra question?
Okay, I think we can squeeze it in.
Okay, and you can, Professor Anthony, you can pass if you want, because so I was doing TAing duties at the same time. So if you mention this like as part of one part of the lecture,
Yeah.
you can just tell me like, you know, go watch it on YouTube. But so if you can answer, how would you kind of situate your approach within the framework that's presented by Lina Salema? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, but in the book on the beginnings of Islamic law, she kind of is pushing back on a lot of the conventional, both Orthodox Islamic way and like Western academic ways of approaching this, I can't even say or this origins period. I guess I like this late antique period. Do you think that book is influencing the way other scholars are approaching this issue? And in terms of you specifically, has it had an influence on you?
So what I do remember about what she said, which I did read the book and I enjoyed some of it, it wasn't one of the bigger influences on what I wrote, but in terms of her comments about the problems of attributing singular origin as opposed to kind of multiple beginnings, right? I think that has merit, right? Part of the problems that this runs into are ways in which some scholars want to create a kind of historical vision that's somehow more authentic or is supposed to kind of replace or kind of narrow the field in terms of who has authority to speak about the past and things like that. The person that kind of has influenced me the most in terms of these types of issues is probably Sheldon Pollock. And as far as I'm concerned, the field of kind of Islamic history does not exist without Muslims or without Muslim scholarship. I think the idea of wanting to replace traditional Muslim scholarship or not learn from it or study it in any way is silly. I mean, my work would be impossible without kind of people that are working from a more traditionalist or faith-based perspective or in institutions that are kind of non-secular. But yeah, I'm not out to replace anybody's story. I'm just basically out to ask historical questions using kind of historical methodology, not to uncover like what is the real Islam, what is the most authentic Islam. And one of the things that one of the reasons why I think that's not something that I want to do is because I think that the way that historical epistemology works, there's not enough certainty, right, to do that, right? You don't have enough certainty to kind of make these sorts of pronouncements. So I think it's not really respectful to either the historical method or philological rigor to pretend like you're discovering something that's absolutely certain or something like that. I don't know. It's kind of rambling answer, but
Thank you.
no problem.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll end it here. Thank you so much, Professor Anthony, for your time. It's
Thank
really
you.
wonderful. Thank you everyone for attending, and looking forward to seeing you in our next event.
Yeah.
Few weeks.
All right. Thanks for the invitation. I had a good time. Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
That was great. Thank you.